Everyone around you seemed to have it figured out by 25. The career was moving, the relationship was stable, the milestones were being checked off in order, and you watched all of it from somewhere on the outside, wondering what was fundamentally wrong with you. Why you couldn't just pick a lane. Why something in you rejected every path that seemed to work effortlessly for everyone else. Carl Jung spent decades studying people like you, people whose inner complexity made them strangers to the conventional timeline. And what he found wasn't that these people were broken or behind. He found that their psychology was operating on a completely different developmental schedule, one that society doesn't recognize, doesn't reward, and doesn't understand. Until suddenly, almost inexplicably, it produces something extraordinary. Jung noticed a pattern so consistent across his patients that he stopped treating it as coincidence. The individuals with the richest inner lives, the deepest self-awareness, the most original thinking, they were almost never the ones who succeeded early. They struggled through their 20s, they often floundered through their 30s. They watched peers build lives that looked impressive, while their own path seemed to go nowhere. But then something shifted, usually in their late 30s, 40s, sometimes even 50s. And what emerged wasn't just moderate success or catching up. It was a kind of achievement so rooted in authenticity that it made early conventional success look hollow by comparison. Jung didn't see this as motivational. He saw it as psychological inevitability. Certain personality structures cannot thrive until the conditions are right, and the conditions require internal development that simply takes time, decades of time. What the world reads as delay, Jung understood as preparation. What looks like falling behind is actually the slow, invisible construction of a psychological foundation most people never build because they never needed to. Today I'm going to show you what Jung discovered about why rare personalities are psychologically incapable of succeeding on society's timeline, what's actually happening during the years that feel wasted, and why the success that eventually emerges from this process is fundamentally different from and more durable than anything built on early conformity. To understand why rare personalities succeed late, you first have to understand what Jung meant by rare. He wasn't talking about people who are special in some flattering, chosen one sense. He was talking about people whose psychological structure deviates significantly from the dominant pattern, people whose way of processing reality, forming identity, and making meaning doesn't align with the templates their culture provides. Jung observed that most people develop what he called the persona early and efficiently. The persona is the social mask, the version of yourself you construct to meet the world's expectations. Most children absorb their environment's values, adopt the available identity templates, and build a functional persona by late adolescence. They know what they want because they want what they've been shown to want. They know who they are because they've become who they were expected to become. And this works. It gets them through education, into careers, into relationships. The persona is efficient, it's functional, and for most people, it's enough. But rare personalities can't do this. Something in their psychology resists the available templates, not out of rebellion or arrogance, out of genuine inability. The persona options their environment offers feel like wearing someone else's skin. They try them on. They attempt to commit. But the friction between who they're performing and who they actually are creates psychological distress that's impossible to ignore. Jung found this resistance wasn't pathological. It was a sign that the individual's authentic self was too complex, too layered, too original to be contained by conventional identity structures. Their psyche was rejecting templates the way a body rejects an incompatible organ, not because something was wrong with the organ or the body, because they simply didn't match. This creates the first major delay. While peers are building careers and relationships on top of functional personas, the rare personality is still searching for an identity that actually fits. They change directions, they start things and abandon them. They can't commit to paths that feel inauthentic, but they haven't yet discovered what authentic looks like for them. From the outside, this looks like indecision, immaturity, failure to launch. From the inside, it feels like drowning in a world that seems designed for someone else. Jung documented that this period of searching, which he saw as an essential phase, typically lasted far longer than anyone around the person could tolerate. Parents grow anxious, friends move ahead, society applies pressure, and the rare personality internalizes all of it as evidence of personal deficiency. They don't think I'm on a different timeline. They think I'm broken. But they're not broken. They're undergoing a process Jung called individuation, the development of a genuinely authentic self that most people never undertake because most people's personas work well enough that authenticity never becomes urgent. Rare personalities don't have that luxury. Their personas keep failing. Their conventional attempts keep collapsing. And each collapse forces them deeper into the psychological work that will eventually become their greatest advantage. Here's what's actually happening during the years that feel wasted. While conventional personalities are building external structures, careers, reputations, social positions, rare personalities are doing internal construction that's invisible but profound. They're integrating shadow material that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. They're developing self-awareness that goes layers deeper than normal introspection. They're building psychological resilience not through success, but through repeated encounters with failure, confusion, and the dismantling of false selves. Jung was fascinated by this process because it was so counterintuitive. The years that looked unproductive were actually the most productive years of these people's lives. They just weren't producing anything visible. They were developing capacities that don't show up on a resume, but that fundamentally alter what a person is capable of. The first capacity is what Jung called shadow integration. Most people repress the parts of themselves that don't fit their persona, their anger, their ambition, their sexuality, their darkness, all pushed underground where it operates unconsciously. Rare personalities, because their personas keep failing, are forced to confront this shadow material directly. They can't maintain the repression because they can't maintain the persona that requires it. This confrontation is agonizing. It means facing aspects of yourself you'd rather deny, recognizing your capacity for selfishness, manipulation, rage, seeing that you're not the purely good person you wanted to believe you were. But Jung found that people who survived this confrontation developed a psychological completeness that was extraordinarily rare. They had access to the full spectrum of human experience, not just the acceptable parts. And this completeness gave them power, creativity, and insight that people operating from partial selves simply couldn't match. The second capacity is authentic discernment. Because rare personalities spend years trying paths that don't fit, they develop an extraordinarily refined sense of what's real versus what's performed. They've worn enough ill-fitting masks to recognize masks instantly, on themselves and on others. This makes them difficult to deceive, hard to manipulate, and almost impossible to impress with surface achievements. They have seen through too many surfaces to be fooled by another one. Jung observed that this discernment, once developed, became a tremendous asset in whatever field these people eventually entered. They could read situations with accuracy that seemed supernatural. They could identify dysfunction in systems that everyone else thought were working fine. They could sense when something was built on authentic foundation versus hollow performance. And they made decisions based on this deeper reading of reality rather than on appearances. The third capacity is what Jung described as tolerance for uncertainty. Most people build their lives on certainty, or at least on the illusion of it. They commit to identities, careers, relationships, and belief systems because certainty feels safe. Rare personalities have had their certainty stripped away repeatedly. They've believed they knew who they were, only to discover they were wrong. They've committed to paths, only to find those paths were dead ends. They've built identities, only to watch them collapse. This sounds devastating, and it is. But Jung found that people who had survived repeated uncertainty developed a psychological flexibility that was almost unbreakable. They could adapt, they could pivot, they could sit with not knowing without panicking. In a world that changes rapidly and punishes rigidity, this capacity became an enormous advantage, but only after years of developing it through experiences that felt like nothing but loss. The fourth capacity is depth of vision. Years spent in internal development create a perspective on life that surface achievers simply don't possess. Rare personalities have spent years asking questions most people never ask. Who am I really? What actually matters? What is this life for? These aren't abstract philosophical exercises for them. They're survival questions born from the failure of every easy answer. Jung found that this depth of vision eventually translated into whatever work these people undertook. Their writing had layers others couldn't achieve. Their leadership came from understanding rather than authority. Their creative work resonated with uncomfortable truths that polished creators avoided. Their businesses solved problems others couldn't see because they'd spent years perceiving what most people overlooked. The depth was portable. It enhanced everything it touched. But here's the critical question. If all this internal development is happening, why does it take so long to translate into external success? Why can't the rare personality just take their shadow integration and authentic discernment and build something visible in their 20s like everyone else? Jung's answer was both simple and painful, because authentic expression requires a foundation that takes decades to build. And you cannot rush the construction of that foundation any more than you can rush the growth of an oak tree by pulling on it. Conventional success works quickly because it's built on borrowed blueprints. You see what works for others, you replicate it, you achieve results. The template already exists, you just follow it. But rare personalities can't use borrowed blueprints because borrowed blueprints don't fit their psychology. They have to create original ones. And creating something original from the raw material of your own consciousness takes an enormous amount of time. Think about what's required. First, you have to discover who you actually are. Not who you were told to be, not who you tried to become, but who you are beneath all the failed personas and abandoned attempts. That discovery alone can take a decade or more, because the authentic self doesn't just reveal itself on command. It emerges slowly, as you strip away everything false, every identity that didn't fit, every path that was someone else's dream, every belief you adopted because it was available rather than because it was true. Then you have to build something external that's an honest expression of that internal reality. This is where rare personalities often face their longest delay. They've done the inner work, they know who they are. But translating that authentic self into something the world can receive, a career, a creative body of work, a way of contributing, requires bridging the gap between inner complexity and outer form, and that bridge doesn't build itself overnight. Jung observed that rare personalities who eventually succeeded had all gone through a specific moment he found profoundly significant, a moment where they stopped measuring themselves against conventional timelines and accepted their own developmental pace as legitimate, not as a consolation prize, not as a cope, as genuine recognition that their path required what it required, and no amount of self-criticism would make it go faster. And if that process of discovering who you actually are beneath the borrowed identities and failed personas feels like something you're living right now, if you're in the middle of stripping away what doesn't fit but haven't yet found what does, there's something that might help ground that work. We put together a guide called True Self-Discovery with 24 practical reflection exercises drawn from Jung's teachings, designed to help you move through exactly this kind of inner excavation with structure instead of chaos. You'll find the link below. Because once that acceptance happened, Jung noticed, the energy that had been consumed by self-punishment became available for creation. The rare personality stopped wasting psychological resources on shame about being behind and redirected all of it toward building something real. And the momentum that followed was extraordinary, not because something magical happened, because something obstructive was finally removed. Jung called this the consolidation phase. After years of wandering, searching, building internal capacity, everything suddenly begins to cohere. The skills that seemed unrelated reveal their connections. The experiences that felt like detours turn out to be essential preparation. The depth of self-knowledge developed through years of struggle becomes the foundation for work that's impossible to fake and impossible to replicate by someone who skipped the internal development. This consolidation often looks sudden from the outside. Friends and family see someone who struggled for years suddenly beginning to produce remarkable work, attract the right opportunities, build something meaningful. It appears as if luck finally found them, or as if they finally got their act together. But Jung understood that there was nothing sudden about it. The consolidation was simply the first visible manifestation of decades of invisible preparation. And the success that emerges from this process has qualities that early conventional success almost never possesses. First, it's sustainable, because it's built on authentic foundation rather than borrowed templates. It doesn't require constant performance to maintain. The rare personality isn't pretending to be someone they're not. In order to keep their achievements, they're expressing who they actually are, which means the work doesn't drain them the way performance-based success drains conventional achievers. It energizes them, because it's honest. Second, the success deepens over time rather than plateauing. Conventional success built on persona often peaks early and then stagnates because the persona has a ceiling. It can only take you as far as the template allows. But success built on authentic individuation has no ceiling because the authentic self continues to develop. The rare personality's work gets richer, more nuanced, more powerful with every year, because the person behind it is still growing. They didn't stop developing when they achieved external results. The external results are a byproduct of ongoing development. Third, the success is resilient. Because rare personalities built their psychological foundation through repeated failure and uncertainty, they have a relationship with setbacks that conventional achievers don't. When challenges arise, and they always do, the rare personality doesn't crumble. They've already survived worse. They've already rebuilt from nothing. They've already lost everything they thought they were and discovered they could survive it. This psychological resilience makes their success almost impossible to destroy permanently. They'll adapt, pivot, rebuild, not because they're optimistic, because they've done it before. Jung also observed something important about the quality of relationships rare personalities built during their later success. Because they'd spent years developing discernment and shadow integration, they didn't attract or tolerate the dynamics that plague conventional achievers. They didn't surround themselves with people who were drawn to their status or achievements. They built connections based on mutual authenticity, something they could recognize precisely because they had spent years learning what authenticity actually looks like from the inside. This meant their personal lives had a depth and stability that matched their professional development. They weren't successful at work and empty at home. They weren't achieving publicly and dying privately. The same internal development that produced their professional capability also produced their capacity for genuine connection. The wholeness Jung described wasn't compartmentalized. It expressed itself across every domain of life. But Jung was honest about the cost. The years of apparent failure leave scars. The loneliness of being out of step with your entire generation creates wounds that don't fully heal just because success eventually arrives. The rare personality who succeeds at 45 still carries the memory of 20 years of feeling defective, still carries the internalized voices that told them they were lazy, unfocused, wasting their potential, still carries the grief of watching life pass while they were doing invisible work that no one valued or understood. Jung didn't minimize this cost. He acknowledged that the path of individuation, the path that rare personalities are forced onto by the failure of conventional templates, is the hardest path a human can walk. It's lonely, it's long, it's frequently humiliating, and the rewards, while genuine, arrive on a timeline that makes the journey feel unbearable while you're in it. But he also observed that the people who walked this path and survived it possessed something that couldn't be acquired any other way: a solidity of self, a clarity of purpose, a depth of perception that made everything they touched more meaningful than what was produced by people who'd never been forced to excavate their own consciousness so thoroughly. Jung described this quality as psychological sovereignty, the condition of being governed by your own authentic center, rather than by external validation, social comparison, or borrowed values. It's the condition of knowing who you are not, because someone told you, but because you discovered it through decades of honest confrontation with yourself. And this sovereignty, once established, doesn't fluctuate with circumstances. It doesn't depend on success continuing. It doesn't require others' approval to maintain. It just is. Stable, quiet, unshakable. This is why rare personalities who succeed later in life often seem different from early achievers, even when their external accomplishments are comparable. There's a grounded quality to them, a lack of desperation, an absence of the constant performance that characterizes people who built their success on persona rather than self. They're not trying to prove anything. They're not terrified of losing what they've built. They're not performing their achievements for an audience. They're simply living from authenticity, and the success is a natural expression of that authenticity rather than a substitute for it. Jung would tell you that if you're someone who's felt behind your entire life, if you've watched everyone else figure it out, while you've struggled to find yourself in a world that doesn't seem designed for your kind of mind, your experience isn't evidence of failure, it's evidence of a psychological process that's more demanding, more thorough, and ultimately more transformative than anything conventional achievers undergo. The years you've spent searching aren't wasted. Every abandoned path taught you something about what isn't you, which is how you eventually discover what is. Every failed persona revealed another layer of authenticity underneath. Every period of confusion was your psyche digesting experiences that conventional minds never process because they never need to. You're not behind. You're building something underground that hasn't broken the surface yet. And when it does, when the internal development finally reaches the point where external expression becomes possible, what emerges will carry the weight of everything you've been through: the depth, the discernment, the resilience, the sovereignty. All of it will be present in your work, your relationships, your presence in the world, not because you performed these qualities, because you forged them in years of honest struggle that most people will never understand. Jung spent his career observing that the most profound contributions to human understanding, art, leadership, and innovation came not from people who peaked early, but from people who developed slowly, painfully in obscurity, and then emerged with something no one could have predicted. Because what they built wasn't assembled from available parts. It was created from the raw material of their own consciousness. And that kind of creation takes exactly as long as it takes. No shortcuts, no acceleration, just the slow, honest, often agonizing work of becoming who you actually are. That's why rare personalities succeed later, not because they're slow, because they're building something that can't be built quickly. Something that requires years of invisible foundation work before a single visible structure can rise. Something that most people never build because most people's conventional templates spare them the demolition that makes original construction necessary. Your timeline is not a deficit. It's an accurate reflection of what you're building and what you're building. If you stay honest, if you keep stripping away what isn't true, if you refuse to settle for a borrowed life, even when borrowing would be easier, will be worth every year it cost you. Jung believed that, not as inspiration, as observation. The rare personalities he studied proved it with their lives. And if you're one of them, still in the invisible years, still doing work no one can see, know that the process you're in has produced extraordinary outcomes in every person who trusted it long enough to see it through. If you haven't yet, check out our guide, True Self-Discovery, 24 practical reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, built to help you find your way within when the world outside offers no map for what you're becoming. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.